let's go ahead and get started. Oops. I'm not sure how to not have
Just
that.
turn the whole machine on.
Yeah. Well, we're going to need it. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad to see such a nice big crowd here. I'm Marilyn May. I'm the chair of the Bar Historians Committee, and we're really pleased to have such a good crowd for our annual luncheon today. I wanted to tell you first a little bit about what the Bar Historians Committee does, and invite your participation in whatever capacity you might be interested. One of our primary goals is to take oral history interviews of members of the bench and bar of Alaska, particularly those who were around in the early days, but we're moving forward in time, so we're getting beyond that now. We also transcribe those interviews, and one of the ways that we invite your participation, if you're interested in historical information, is to donate money toward these transcripts. So if there's either a particular transcript you might be interested in, I can go through the list of available names with you, or you could just give us some money and we'll put it to a good use. We keep an archive in the Boney Courthouse in the State Law Library of materials about members of the bench and bar, and also events and things like that. We write occasional bar rag articles. We present the annual Nora Gwynn Award to an individual who's made an impact on an effort to assist Alaska's rural residents, particularly the Native population, overcome language and cultural barriers to obtaining justice through the legal system. And we organize this annual luncheon CLE and other occasional brown bag and bigger CLEs through the year. I want to thank a few people who helped make this possible. First, the new CLE director, Lori Brownlee, who's running around, and she's the one who turned off the slideshow. CLE coordinator Lynn Coffey, who's one of the people who, they're right there in the doorway, one of the people who checked you in. Executive assistant Holly Rhoden, who's in Bali, poor thing, and she keeps our committee in line throughout the year. Also, fellow luncheon subcommittee members Mike Schweiger and Kelly Taylor. I saw Mike somewhere earlier back there. Oh, over here. And Kelly and Deb Perryman, who did some research for us for the slideshow. And also, I thought maybe it would be a good idea to have members of the Bar Historians Committee who are here stand up so you can identify them and be people that you can talk to about bar history. Thank you. And also, definitely, Margaret Newman, our unsung hero, who is making sure we have a videotape of this event. And then I want to thank two of our sponsors, the Alaska Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and the United States Department of Justice. And without their support, we would not have the program that we have today. I want to introduce our newest public defender, Samantha Chereau. I want to invite you to turn off or silence your cell phones so you won't be that guy. I think mine is not silenced, so you guys can remind me when I get back to my chair to do that. It would be very embarrassing. Tell you that the bathrooms are around the corner. You would take a left out of the room and a left again. They're over here. There are note cards and pens on every table for you to write questions, and Lori Brownlee will be running around to pick them up. So if you have questions when it comes to that point, you can hold up your cards and Lori will come grab them. Please fill out your evaluation forms after the program. They're really helpful going forward. I also want to point out there is an agenda in your packet. You have a little written agenda of what you can expect to see today. Near the back of that packet, there's a list of all the public defenders in Alaska, and there's a one-page history of the start and so on. And then the that's all of that housekeeping stuff. And now I want to introduce our first speaker, Victor Carlson, who was our original public defender. He arrived in Alaska in 1962 to work as an assistant attorney general in Juneau. He went from there to be a prosecutor in Fairbanks. Then he was the attorney for the Greater Anchorage Area Borough when he was selected as our first public defender, and subsequently was appointed to the Superior Court. And he's going to talk to us about setting up that first office.
Thank you, Marilyn. If I'm too close to the microphone, wave, or if I'm not close enough, wave. It is a privilege to be here today and to share this microphone with one of the best bosses I ever had, Barb Brink. When I was an assistant public defender in Bethel at the end of my career. The Public Defender Agency was created by a statute passed in 1969, as you know, with the support of Representative Wendell Kay, a very well qualified defense lawyer here in town, and with the support of the President of the State Senate, Terry Miller, and many others, of course. Governor Miller chose me from the list submitted by the Judicial Council. Our budget, as Quinn corrected me today, was $260,000. I thought it was only $250,000. In our system, a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Without an attorney to argue on one's behalf, the presumption of innocence and due process are often ignored. That's why it's so important that we have good defense lawyers. It was necessary to establish the independence of the agency. That's one of the things that I thought was very important, especially as perceived by our clients. One of the ways I tried to do this was to walk into a village from the airstrip instead of accepting the offer of the trooper who was there to meet the district attorney. Sometimes it was a long walk. I also chose to have our offices in a private building and not in the courthouse. Here in Anchorage, our first office was above Howard's Gun Shop on 5th Avenue, where Town Square Park is now. And in Ketchikan, as Colin Middleton can well tell you, it was in the old hospital, an imposing building. My optimism for the success of the agency was greatly increased when Colin Middleton of Burr, Boney and Pease and Jim Gilmore of Hughes, Thorsness, Lowe, Gantz, etc., asked to be considered, and Roberta Johnson, who had been the chief administrative officer in the Department of Law, chose to work with us. I knew that we had a good crew. The other first public defenders, including Dick Madsen, Dave Backstrom, Brian Timbers, Chuck Robinson, Herb Soule, when he returned from the Peace Corps in Brazil, and the support staff made my job very easy, for which I am forever grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Vic. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Susan Orlansky. You probably all know her, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. She arrived in Alaska in 1980. She worked for the court system for a year, and then she worked 11 years at the Public Defender Agency before going into private practice. She's currently of counsel with Reeves Amodio, and she's in great demand as a presenter and moderator for CLEs, and we're very pleased to have her here. Thank you, Susan.
Okay, so I want to add my thanks to the Historians Committee for organizing the event, and to everyone in the audience for coming, to Judge Carlson for getting us started, and to the panelists who've agreed to speak during the rest of the program. from our planning sessions. I know we have a lot to cover and not nearly enough time, so I want to launch in without delay. I'm going to take it for granted that you know who we are. We have Dana Fay, Barb Brink, Quinlan Steiner, three of the past public defenders, and David Carroll, who's here from the Sixth Amendment Center. So I'm going to turn straight to the panel of the three ex-public defenders other than Judge Carlson, and let's go in chronological order. I want you to tell us, please, how you got started as an assistant public defender. Why did you want to be a public defender? Why did you want to be the public defender? And give us a brief history of the agency over the years that you worked there, and can you do it all in about 5 or 6 minutes?
Starting
Go
with
ahead.
me?
Yeah, we're doing chronological order. Dana and then Barb and then
All right.
Quinn.
Well, I had come out of law school to clerk for the Alaska Supreme Court, and I heard about the Alaska Public Defender Agency shortly after I arrived. It was my dream to do criminal defense work. All of my co-op jobs, save one, were criminal defense oriented co-ops, and so I knew right away I wanted to be an assistant public defender at the Alaska Public Defender Agency. And Brian Shortell, who preceded me, had hired an amazing group of trial attorneys, some of the most superb trial attorneys in the state. Eric Sanders was working there, John Suddock, John Murtaugh, Jeff Feldman, and many others. And that has really always been a tradition at the Public Defender Agency to hire the best and most wonderful lawyers. Vic, of course, started that tradition with Colin Middleton, who is here today. Colin, where are you? Will you stand up? You should be recognized as one of the originals. And Jim Gilmore and Dick Madsen, but Brian had assembled an incredible group, and there was a real sense of collegiality, perhaps a bit of siege mentality, contributed to that. Chris Rigos and Mark Weaver had just designed a T-shirt that everybody wore that said "A reasonable doubt at a reasonable price." It was our public defender T-shirt, which had a scales of justice. I'm wearing my little nod to that, with law books on the heavy side of the scale, and the little Monopoly police officer hanging by his fingertips
Here, Dana,
off of the other.
I brought show and tell.
So it was just, it was an exciting place to work because of the people who were there. Brian also deserves particular credit for how many women he hired for the Alaska Public Defender Agency at a time when there weren't many women in the bar at all, and certainly not many women nationally who were criminal defense attorneys. These are not just a few token women. I mean, he had a lot of women. He hired Sue Ellen Tatter shortly before I came on, Nancy Shaw, Elaine Andrews, Deborah Smith, now U.S. Magistrate Judge Christine Schlois, Meg Green, Debbie Paquette. I mean, there were a lot of us. And in fact, at one point, 4 of us, Elaine and I and Debbie Smith and Christine Schlois, were all doing misdemeanors together, and we dubbed ourselves the misdemeanors. And we actually were all kind of excited about writing a TV sitcom plot where Elaine would have been the Mary Tyler Moore misdemeanor, and I think I probably would have been the Rhoda, comedy misdemeanor. But Brian really started that tradition, and I think I built on that. We had many women as well when I was public defender, but I was just following in Brian's footsteps. Cindy Strout, Beth Kurtula, Tina Kobayashi, Barb Brink, Susan Orlansky, and Jacqueline Bressers were the misdemeanors 2.0 when they were doing that trial work. In terms of how I got the job, I had never dreamed of being the public defender that Brian was appointed to the bench. We had a lot of turnover in those days. People tended to stay 2, max 3 years before they would move on to another endeavor. So at 3.5 years there, I was sort of the old woman there, and He asked me to be the acting public defender, but of course that position is filled through the Judicial Council with appointment of the governor, and Governor Hammond appointed me to the position.
Good.
I went to law school to be a public defender. Not to date myself too much, but when I was an undergrad, I took a criminal procedure class. The first case we read was Gideon versus Wainwright. And I was stunned that just a little period of time before I was in college, that we were sending people to court without lawyers and having them fend for themselves. So fortunately, I decided early that that was a noble thing to do, and I would like to do that. And I concentrated on that when I was in law school. I came up for a one-year clerkship as well. I was clerking for Supreme Court Justice Roger Connor, and I had all the intentions of going back to California, where I had clerked in public defender offices, had taken and passed the bar, and was just waiting to get the call when Senior Justice Fabe saved my life and offered me a job at the Alaska Public Defender, and I took it because it was my dream job, and it proved to be exactly so. You know, I am so grateful to be invited to come and reminisce about the agency. I could go on for days, but fortunately, due to the human memory, they're all happy memories. I brought up one feeling I recall, and maybe some of you have experienced this. I remember as a misdemeanor attorney, I was walking over to court to do my first jury trial, and I was thinking, man, I could really use a car accident right now. Not a big one, just a little one. Never happened. And I wish that for every trial. So the office had a spirit of camaraderie and esprit de corps, and it wasn't like we just worked together. When I joined, we were in the public defender office that happened to be right across the street from the Pioneer Bar, and much of our work might have taken place in the branch office. We had a lot of changes over the years. I never had an aspiration to be the public defender, but in 1988, in fact, after having been a trial lawyer for 6 years, I was fried. And I looked for other jobs and actually interviewed for other jobs and was offered other jobs. And I actually made a choice to stay at the agency, which actually made things a lot better. It's better when you're choosing to be there than when you think, oh my God, how did I get here? So John Salemi became the public defender upon Dana's departure, and he offered me the position to be the deputy public defender, and I thought, well, that's good. It's not trial work for a little while, and it's interesting, and I'd like to do something new. So that's how I got started on this management track, which occasionally I think I should have just stayed a felony trial lawyer for my whole life. But being a deputy was interesting and exciting and a whole new world of things that I knew nothing about, like the political process and the legislative process and hiring and firing and budget. Well, fortunately, as the deputy, I didn't have anything to do with the budget. I didn't really know till I became the public defender how that was going to hit me. And it was exciting times. I mean, just think about the advent in technology. Again, not to date myself, but I was there for the installation of the first fax machine. That was incredible. Can you imagine not running over to court at 4:29 and a half, trying to get this thing filed by the due date? It was huge. We also were blessed with having a lot of support in the Department of Administration. We had commissioners who were very interested in technology, so although it would have been easy to leave us behind as computers became more and more a daily staple and technology made our jobs more and more efficient, we were taken there by the Department of Administration, and I think that had a lot to do with promoting our efficiencies and making us better lawyers and actually helping us to cope with what at times seemed like a large caseload. When I started at the PD, we had about 69 lawyer positions. Mostly they were filled about 65 and 66, and we had 19,000 cases. That's when I started. I don't remember what it was when I finished, but I know it was a lot more. And so I think that one thing I've learned by talking to all the members of this panel and reminiscing is that the agency is very much the same as it was in 1969 when it was formed, and as it was in 2005 when I left, and as it is today. What an incredible group of people. And I'm proud to have been a part of it.
Quinn, before you start, just following up on Barb's last line, can we get a show of hands of everybody in this room who served as a public defender? It is an amazing bunch of people. Yes. All right, go ahead, Quinlan. Thanks.
I had never intended to even go to law school, let alone become a public defender. I worked in business. I had a business degree, and I worked for a bank, and I left that job looking for something that would sort of meld my interests of work and public service. I wanted to provide something in a way that was different from business. But I didn't know what that was until I met a public defender who's in the audience, Margie Mock. I'd never met anyone who liked their job, let alone loved their job. And I was like, I want to get involved. And then I met a lot of people who loved their jobs. And then I volunteered. I volunteered as an investigator, and I got involved in cases that really were compelling. And this was a sort of a perfect fit in terms of what I wanted to do and work and public service. So I went to law school, and the only thing I wanted to do was be a public defender. And I volunteered, and I was an intern, and I was an extern, and I did my work, and I was just captivated by it. And I've said this before, I loved going to work every day, and that never changed. Every day was a day that we were trying to figure out how to make the agency better and how to do the work. I worked primarily as an appellate lawyer when I started, and I got involved in sort of policy issues more so than anything else. I really wanted complex cases and long cases and cases that dealt with policy, and I just got intrigued by that. And that led to a decision to apply for the job of public defender, to try to participate in that. Why I did it, I can hardly even imagine why I applied for the job. I never regretted it, though. I mean, it was a challenge. It was interesting, and the best part about it is what's, I think, been noted is what an incredible group of creative, smart, interested, dedicated individuals. And it was fantastic to learn and train and just be a part of that. And I think there's no way for me to describe what I'm proud of other than to say just being a part of that and just being involved in that kind of work really made a difference in terms of how much I enjoyed it.
Let me ask the three of you. There's sort of a stereotype that in the early days of the Public Defender Agency, most of the lawyers were single, they worked hard, they played hard, and they burned out after a couple of years. And then maybe around 1980, the idea of staying at the Public Defender for 10 or 20 years or an entire career became more common. But then people wanted more balance in their lives because they had families and they needed some sanity to stay effective for a long term. It's probably oversimplified, but is that generally a fair picture of how the agency grew and changed?
I think, I became the public defender in 1981, and I think, again, Brian Shortell is the one who set this course by hiring so many women, many of whom had kids while they were at the agency, including me. And in 1981, when I became the public defender, I was concerned about the turnover because it wasn't the best thing for the clients. So I instituted a lot of, for 1981, they were unusual job structures. We had rotations in Anchorage and Fairbanks where lawyers worked 8 months and then rotated out 4 months, so 3 people in 2 positions. We had some job shares where people each came in 3 days a week. When Susan Orlansky was the head of appeals, Susan Orlansky, the premier appellate lawyer in the entire state of Alaska, we had her for so many years more than we deserved her in terms of what she was getting out of it, perhaps, because she wanted her summers off with her kids. And I said, no problemo. And I figured out another way. We got continuances in the summer for our filings, I think, and we brought interns in. I had Iditarod mushers who wanted to be public defenders half the year and to train their dogs and run the Iditarod the other half the year. So Dave Munson was a public defender in Kotzebue for 6 months, and then somebody else went out. Vern Halter was a public defender for 6 months of the year, and then would go out and run. And if you don't think there was anything in it for me, Vern Halter named one of his puppies Dana, although I'm pretty sure she wasn't that good of an athlete if she was going to take after her namesake. So I think that is what allowed people to stay for years and years, because they didn't burn out as fast, and we structured it in a way. First of all, we had incredible support from the Department of Administration. It was a hassle burger for them because we constantly had people terminating, coming back because of the rotations, and they were super supportive because they trusted that this was the best thing for our clients, which was everybody's interest, to keep that longevity and experience in the agency. And when lawyers left, they would give a week of time after they'd left to volunteer to do the transition, and the person coming in would give a week of time. So we actually got 2 weeks per attorney or 4 weeks per transition each time, so that it was a good thing for the clients, not disruptive.
Each of you, what are you particularly proud of as you look back over your time as a public defender? Barb?
I think that given the size of Alaska, providing criminal justice in the rural areas is and always will be a challenge. And I had seen, while I was the deputy, that many people in the rural areas felt like they were floating on an iceberg all alone with no support and no help and no way of obtaining that. So I really wanted to make it a point to have the people who were at the agency, and all of them, not just the attorneys, but the investigators and the support staff, begin to feel like they were more of a team, that the urban areas would bear responsibility for helping the rural areas, that the rural people would get to know not only the urban people, but each other. I mean, when I was the public defender, I don't know what it is now, but 5 of my offices were one lawyer offices. Those people didn't have anybody to brainstorm with, to chat with. They tried to make the time and they tried to make the space. And, you know, one thing I did is I always had a training program. We always brought the lawyers in to be trained and the investigators to be trained. But I started promoting things that would make people mingle better. The rule was you had to wear your name tag and you had to introduce yourself to 3 people. I had a supervisor's lunch while everybody else was off doing their own thing. The supervisors were treated to a very nice lunch. The only rule was you couldn't sit at a table with somebody who was in your office. It had to be somebody else. And I felt, we even had staff meetings once a month where the supervisors would be on the phone, and each month one office had to describe who they were, what they did, how they were coping, what their biggest challenges were, and I think it helped. I just think that people felt they were more a part of the whole. They had other people to call. One lawyer offices didn't just have to call Anchorage or Fairbanks. They could call the other one lawyer offices who had already dealt with this problem. And, it's certainly not a perfect system, but I think that promoting that kind of team effort was something that I was proud of.
Quinlan, do you want to talk about something you're proud of or something you were challenged by? I'm sure they were both.
There were plenty of both. I think what I inherited was an organization that was really focused on client-centered representation, and that was something that was imprinted on me as a new lawyer. And I hope that one of the things that I was able to do was imprint that on other lawyers. Hopefully me personally, but hopefully as the agency as it grew. One of the challenges was like, how do we make the agency better? How do we make the criminal justice system better? How do we do that? I worked directly with deputies, one who was experienced in civil practice, Linda Beecher, and Margie, who had all this appellate experience, and Doug Moody and Gary Sobray as deputies for a long time over the criminal section. And we honestly would spend every day trying to figure out what can we do to make it better. And it's an incredibly challenging task. I was proud to just be part of that. I was proud that every day we were able to get up and try to figure out how to do that. We had successes, and I think there were some things that didn't work the way we wanted to, but we were always trying to adjust to that. So the challenge and what pride I have from it all comes from the same place. And the folks that we worked with were on board with what can we do? How can we pitch in? Let's try something different if we can. And to give their ideas to try and make that work. And, I think through that process, there were some improvements that were made that helped our clients.
Yeah. Daniel, let me come back to you. Same question. You want to share either a particular challenge or a particular triumph from your era?
Well, I would agree with Barb that one of the challenges was making sure that the same excellence of representation was occurring in rural Alaska, and making sure that the support was there for those lawyers, but also that you could get people of the same caliber in Barrow, in Bethel, that we had in Anchorage. And I think we were really successful at that. We had Blair McCune and David Weed in Bethel. When I opened the Barrow office, Joel Bolger, now our Chief Justice, was the person I tapped to open that Barrow office. Bob Evans was in Kotzebue. So we had some stellar lawyers, but that was a challenge. But probably the biggest challenge was the budget, always. And actually one real advantage of a statewide agency where you can move people around, even within the office, to sub in for each other or call somebody in from an outer office when there's some pressure, or send somebody out to an outer office when there's some pressure, is that it gives you some flexibility to be able to handle that budget. The biggest challenge I ever faced was when the governor said sort of X% cut across the board, every agency, deal with it. And the way we dealt with it was we had a tiny administrative staff, and they didn't make very much money. So it was really, I wanted to make sure they weren't taking any kind of hit. And I required every lawyer in the office to take 2 weeks of leave without pay. And that was how we balanced the budget, because we couldn't afford to lose any people on the ground. So each attorney took 2 weeks of leave without pay. And actually, when we had the same budget crisis at the court system in 2015, I did the exact same thing. We reached out to the judges. We didn't require it, but we asked for volunteers to take leave without pay. The living with the budget was always, it's always been a challenge, but again, the statewide agency, the flexibility. I read the recent report on the Public Defender Agency talking about a silo, but one advantage of just having one integrated agency is that you can move the resources around as you need to have that flexibility, so that I think I had Susan coming in when she was in appeals to zip in to do a China case, or to zip in to do something else, because that gave me the ability to cover everything we needed to cover and to cover it well.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question before we call on David to do his presentation. So the question I wanted to ask was about changing technology. Any of the three of you, how did changing technology change the way that the agency lawyers can represent clients? And were they good for clients or bad? I'm thinking of something like the increasing uses of telephonic and video appearances, which saves travel costs, but some personal connections are lost. What's your overall perspective on changing technology and agency representation of clients? Quinlan, you want to start?
Sure. I think there's a lot of advantage you can take of technologies. You know, with regard to teleconferencing and that sort of thing, I always saw that as a way of increasing communication and not supplanting it. That in-person meeting with clients was really how you developed a relationship and how you were able to give somebody advice so they could make a decision in their case. You know, the other technologies that we took of advantage was something like an iPad, which actually allowed lawyers to work more. And, you know, that was great. You know, you get emails at night, you'd get emails while people were in court, and people wanted to fill that time. They were thinking about their cases and wanting to take advantage of that. But I think technology in particular, you need to be careful of, in the sense that it's not supplanting some of the obligations that you have or the methods that you do to represent a client. It needs to facilitate that.
Barb, any comments on technology?
Well, I've already expressed my love for the fax machine, but I think technology during my era really helped us cope with a lack of support staff. I mean, when I covered the Palmer calendar for a year, we didn't have an office, and I tootled out in my Mazda every morning and tootled back at night. We met in the court hallway and conference room, but I would dictate motions and things to be done, drop that cassette off with the secretary and move on. And, you know, by the time I left, I think we only had one lawyer left who just couldn't divorce himself from dictation. A lot of people learned how to type to process their own things. Technology made it easier to not have to rebuild the wheel every time, work off something that somebody else had started, move it in the right direction. What I see today is that I think we're not taking advantage of technology enough to help us. I mean, if they can do video court hearings, why can't I call the jail and video conference with my client? What's so hard about that? So I think that we should think of ways, or it'd be good to convince the other players in the system, like corrections or public safety, that this would enhance the functioning of the criminal justice system if we could improve the use of technology to enhance communication, both with our clients, opposing parties, the court. So I think that there's things that we haven't even thought of yet that could be very helpful.
All right, I think I've got a million more questions, but one of my job is to play timekeeper. So I'm going to say we need to have an opportunity for David Carroll to speak now. Historians Committee brought up David to help put the discussion of indigent defense into a national context. So I'm going to let David introduce himself and share his presentation, and then we'll come back to the panel and ask you to relate some of David's comments to the Alaska experience.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Sorry, I haven't figured out the whole time adjustment from the East Coast yet. My name is David Carroll. I'm the Executive Director of the Sixth Amendment Center. With me today is the Deputy Director, John Mosier, so if people have questions afterwards and I'm tied up, John's also available. The Sixth Amendment Center is a nonpartisan organization that was created to assist federal, local, and state policymakers meet the constitutional obligation to provide effective representation to the indigent accused at all critical stages of a criminal or delinquency proceeding in cases carrying a potential loss of liberty. We do so by measuring jurisdictions against prevailing case law and national standards, and then assisting state and local governments overcome any of the deficiencies that we might have identified. I do want to mention that I am here today under a generous grant of the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. So let's get going. This year marks the 56th anniversary of Gideon versus Wainwright, guaranteeing the right to counsel in state court. Although the Gideon decision is a very important decision, I find in my travels all across the country that people have a profound misunderstanding of the Gideon case. Too often I find people assume that no one in America had a right to counsel until Gideon. And that means Gideon can too often be thought of as a 1960s civil rights case decided by a decidedly liberal Warren court. So even though this is my favorite quote in Gideon, I draw your attention to the very next statement. From the very beginning, our state and national constitutions and laws have laid great emphasis on procedural and substantive safeguards designed to ensure fair trials before impartial tribunals in which every defendant stands equal before the law. Now, wait a minute. From the very beginning, is that true? And the answer is yes. Courts in America have been appointing lawyers for the poor since before the United States was an independent country. You see, the adversarial system of justice is rooted in the very fabric of our nation. Because the European people that arrived on the shores of America were in many instances those who had been subject to religious persecution in the European courts, the people of the new emerging nation were not content to adopt the justice system of their mother countries. Having experienced tyranny firsthand, the people of the new American colonies were suspicious of concentrated power in the hands of the few. An individual's right to liberty was self-evident, and therefore there needed to be a high threshold to allow government to take away the liberty that the Creator had endowed in each and every individual. Even before the American Revolution, American courts were appointing defense attorneys for the accused. Even before there were professional prosecutors in this country, there were criminal defense lawyers advocating for the accused. Don't believe me? The very first right to counsel statute in our country, the country that would become the United States, is from Rhode Island in 1660. Although this is written in Old English, the gist is that anyone can accuse anyone of anything, and as the statute states, out of malice or envy. The accused needs a lawyer to establish that a charge is unfounded. I'm always amazed that 300 years later in the United States Supreme Court case of Gideon makes the exact same argument that Rhode Island did in 1660. So, colonial courts are appointing attorneys early on to prevent the tyranny of big government from unduly taking away a person's liberty. Indeed, it's John Adams who risks his reputation for these very ideals of liberty prior to the American Revolution by defending in court the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre, stating years later that a defense lawyer ought to be the very last thing a person should be without in a free country. With the introduction of defense lawyers in colonial America, criminal trials started to become, trials. Procedural rules started to be written down and codified. Evidence, including hearsay, could no longer be introduced without restraint. Allegations of criminality were increasingly contested, and it was the birth of the adversarial process itself. That is what criminal lawyers did to bring this to the United States. And once Americans threw off the shackles of tyrannical monarchy in the Revolution, the Patriots were not about to create a new tyranny in the form of a federal government that could infringe on the rights of individuals. Thus, the framers of the U.S. Constitution created a Bill of Rights to specifically protect people and their personal liberty from the tyranny of government. All people, they argued, should be free to express unpopular opinions, or choose one's own religion, or take up arms to protect one's homes and family, without the fear of retaliation from the state. Preeminent in the Bill of Rights is the idea that no one's liberty can ever be taken away without the process being fair. That is, to protect against the tyrannical impulses of government, the country's founders devised an adversarial system of government that consciously made it difficult for government to put people in jail. A jury made up of everyday citizens, protections against self-incrimination, and the right to have a lawyer advocating on one's behalf are all American ideas of justice enshrined in the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution and ratified in 1791. That federal courts are required to appoint attorneys to the indigent charged with capital crimes became enshrined in the 1970s Judiciary Act. That means it wasn't just a permissive right to counsel, but an affirmative right to counsel, that when a criminal case, capital case was charged, that someone had to be appointed a lawyer. And remember, when we're talking back in the 1790s, almost every single federal crime was a capital charge. Think things like horse thievery and others. So felonies, people were being appointed criminal defense lawyers in the federal courts. So you can see that the right to counsel was firmly taking root in the 18th century America. And importantly, outside the 13 original colonies, since most states were subsequently carved out of federal territories, and since there was a federal right to counsel, the right to counsel in most states predate their own statehood. By the mid-1870s, indeed, Nevada, of all places, becomes the first state in the country to require attorneys for the accused in every type of case, including misdemeanors, and, importantly, the requirement for the payment of attorneys for those services. Many other Western states followed suit. So by the time Gideon rolls around, there really were only a handful of states that did not already have the right to counsel for poor people accused of crime. And many of those states had the right to counsel out of practice, they just hadn't put it into statute. Really, it's the states from Florida to Texas where the right to counsel had not taken root. And that is because those states come out of Spanish and French jurisprudence where the right to counsel was not fully realized. And that's why perhaps all of the major Sixth Amendment case law comes out of those states. So for instance, Gideon's a Florida case. In Alabama, you have Powell and Shelton and Argesinger. Texas has Rothgary, et cetera, et cetera. So I said at the top of my presentation that Gideon was important, but just not for the reason most people think it is. You see, Gideon is not just a Sixth Amendment case. It is also a 14th Amendment case. That is, states are required by the 14th Amendment to ensure that the Sixth Amendment case law is properly implemented. In post-Gideon, there is a lot of such case law that the states are responsible to ensure is properly met. So Gideon, of course, we all know, established the right to counsel in felonies, but the subsequent cases further define the right to counsel applies to direct appeals, in delinquency proceedings, and misdemeanors that carry only suspended sentences. So when the United States Supreme Court delineated when in the process a lawyer must be provided, defining the critical stages of the criminal process as well. There are really too many critical stages to go through each and every one, and I know most of you are already familiar with them. But I do highlight that plea negotiations is one of those stages, meaning a prosecutor may never engage an uncounseled defendant unless and until a court has determined that a waiver of counsel was made knowingly and intelligently. I raise that because someone on the panel mentioned that they couldn't believe that there's uncounseled defendants going on. I can tell you America's dirty little secret is that thousands of people go to jail every single day without ever speaking to a criminal defense lawyer. So here again are more of the critical stages. Basically what you need to understand is that the 14th Amendment requirements on states are great and ever evolving. The case I really want to speak to is a case that comes out of a case called United States v. CRONIC. This is the case in which, I'm going to move forward a little bit here, that this is the case in which the United States Supreme Court defines what the parameters are of a effective indigent defense system. It's the sister case to Strickland, which talks about whether an individual attorney provides effective representation. But CRONIC, in fact, goes on to define the system itself. So as the court says, there are certain circumstances where the structure is so deficient that any lawyer would fail to provide effective assistance of counsel. And the case they point to, of course, is the case of Powell v. Alabama. And this is the case of the so-called Scottsboro Boys. In that case, the judge handpicked the attorneys who did not have sufficient time to adequately defend the accused, and the attorneys were not qualified to handle the complexity of the cases they were issued. In short, the judge chose real estate lawyers the morning of a trial to represent all of the defendants at once. In CRONIC's sister case, Strickland v. Washington, the court would say that when government structures an indigent defense system in ways that interfere with the representation of the defendant, the system itself should be considered presumptively ineffective. Now, I could stand here all day going into great detail about Strickland, CRONIC, and Powell, but the ABA has basically boiled down all this case law into 10 simple principles. The 10 principles represent, in the words of the ABA, the fundamental criteria necessary to design a system that provides effective, efficient, high-quality, ethical, conflict-free legal representation for criminal defendants who are unable to afford an attorney. Now, the 10 principles include 4 main parameters of the CRONIC analysis, including early appointment of counsel, which is principle 3, the qualification, training, and resources of attorneys, principle 6, independence of the defense function, which is one of the things we want to talk about here, and sufficiency of time for lawyers to provide effective representation. So, to understand these, for example, Principle 3 talks about early appointment of counsel. Indeed, commentary states that counsel should usually be appointed within 24 hours. Now, just to give you a sense of what happens in other states, in 2018, the Sixth Amendment Center published our report on Mississippi. Now, in Mississippi, all felonies must be filed by indictment, not just by information. Formal appointment only occurs after arraignment on the indictment. Now, just think what that means in rural Mississippi, when a grand jury may only sit once a year. Defendants can sit in jail for over a year before they ever get appointed an attorney. That is one of the issues that we face in this country. Now, Principle 1 is related to the independence of the defense function. It says the defense function should be independent from political influence and subject to judicial supervision only in the same manner and to the same extent as retained counsel. Now again, independence is not critical because the ABA says it's important. It is critical because the United States Supreme Court says it is. It is just that the ABA is trying to make it more easily understood for policymakers. So for example, here are a number of cases in which the Supreme Court comments on the need for independence of the defense function. Ferry v. Ackerman states the independence of appointed counsel to act as an adversary is an indispensable element of effective representation. In Polk County versus Dodson, government has a constitutional obligation to respect the professional independence of the public defenders whom it engages. Continuing on, a defense lawyer best serves the public not by acting on the state's behalf or in concert with it, but rather by advancing the undivided interests of the client. A public defender is not amenable to administrative direction in the same sense as other state employees. Even in Strickland v. Washington, it says independence of defense counsel is constitutionally protected. So, what does that mean in the real world, and what have we encountered? Well, we wanted to highlight New Mexico because it has a similar system to Alaska in that it has a state-funded public defender system. In 2011, then Governor Susan Martinez asked for the chief public defender's resignation in the middle of a budgetary hearing because he had the gall to say to the legislature that the governor's budget was insufficient and that attorneys were already tolling under excessive caseloads. The governor had direct appointments of the public defender in New Mexico. So this was shocking to most of us in the country that someone would be terminated in the middle of a legislative hearing. Now, lest anyone thinks I'm picking on Republicans, let me state that something very similar happened under former Governor Bill Richardson, a Democrat. Indeed, in an article in one of the leading newspapers stated that Richardson appointed a state public defender who was a lawyer that had contributed the most to his reelection campaign, even though that lawyer had no experience managing a law firm and indeed had not practiced criminal defense law in quite some time. In fact, this is why the ABA talks about the need for independence. The ABA 10 Principles calls for every single defense system to be overseen by an independent commission rather than a governor or a department of the executive branch to prevent precisely the type of interference that we saw in New Mexico. And Governor Richardson vetoed a bill that had overwhelmingly passed both chambers of the legislature with overwhelming bipartisan support that would have created such an independent commission. Now, I'm not saying this is for all states, but what happened in New Mexico, which is quite surprising, is that the electorate addressed the issue by overwhelmingly voting by 62% on a constitutional amendment requiring the independence of the public defender system and the creation of a statewide independent commission. Now, I'm harping on independence because in my experience of over 20 years going all across this country, independence of the defense function is the most critical aspect of an indigent defense system, because without it, you are hardly able to obtain any of the other principles. I have yet to find a jurisdiction that had an excessive caseload problem that at root was really the excessive caseloads were more the symptom, and the actual diagnosis was a lack of independence. So we go on from there to the other principles of what is required. Principle 5 is the requirement that indigent defense caseloads be controlled to permit effective representation. Or, as the court in Powell said, impeding counsel's time is not to proceed promptly in the calm spirit of regulated justice, but to go forward with the haste of a mob. Principle 8 is parity. There should be a parity of workload, salaries, and other resources between prosecution and the defense. Or, as the United States Supreme Court states, while a criminal trial is not a game in which the participants are expected to enter the ring with a near match in skills, neither is it a sacrifice of unarmed prisoners to gladiators. Excessive indigent defense workload and parity are closely aligned because public defenders, as you know, do not control their own workload. Rather, legislatures define crimes, police enforce those laws, prosecutors decide to proceed with certain cases, and the courts determine the defendant's eligibility for a public defender. The indigent defense function must provide the same level of effectiveness to each and every defendant. I go to a lot of places where people say, yeah, but on the whole, we do pretty good. That's not what the Constitution requires. That is, it is not constitutional to provide effective representation in the majority of cases, or to triage a handful of cases that are interesting and have interesting issues against the bulk of the cases that will be pled. It's not constitutional to provide effective representation with the primary system, but not a conflict system. And it's not effective to provide, or it's not constitutional to provide effective representation in just county and state courts and leaving the municipalities to fend for themselves. Unfortunately, in our experience, non-independent public defense systems cannot successfully stand up to excessive caseloads. If a governor, for example, and this example was mentioned earlier today, asks for executive branch organizations to take a 10% cut, non-independent systems tend to fall in line. The problem, of course, is that most systems' almost entire indigent defense budget is personnel. Therefore, unlike a Department of Public Works that can not buy a truck or push off some technology, almost every cut in a public defender office has to be a cut in personnel. So I really encourage people in looking at this system, and I can't say I know Alaska. We have not studied it independently. I can only tell you that these lessons from elsewhere give me some pause when I read about your system. But in closing, let me be clear. The right to counsel is the right of the individual to his or her liberty. There's no greater form of tyranny for big government to take away one's liberty without the process being fair. Thank you very much for inviting me to your state. I was glad to see the sun come out today because I had 2 days of kind of gloom and doom. But I hope I've been able to contribute something to your dialogue up here, and we're happy to talk about it later on. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to bring it back to Alaska and the Alaska panelists. Dana, Barb, Quinlan, what did David say that made you think of your experiences in Alaska, either because the Alaska story in the area is similar or because it's different?
Well, I'll start. I will say shortly before I was appointed public defender, the administration of the Public Defender Agency budget, kind of the big departmental aspect of that, had been moved from the governor's office to the Department of Administration. And I served under 3 different governors. I was reappointed. I was appointed by a Republican, reappointed by a Democratic governor, and I served with 4 different commissioners and probably 6 different deputy commissioners, and they could not have been more supportive. They were, I mean, the public defender being in the Department of Administration is sort of a weird fit because Department of Administration does personnel and telecommunications and just 100 different things that really don't look very much like what we do. But the deputies understood the importance and the constitutional importance of what we were doing, and were really great to work with. As I gave the example of even the personnel hassles I caused them by doing a lot of job shares and rotations, they couldn't have been more supportive. In terms of that independence piece, of course, our statute, which may not be true in New Mexico, I don't know about their statute, but our statute appoints the public defender for a 4-year term. The public defender can only be removed by the governor for good cause, and even then the governor has to make a report within a certain number of hours or days to the legislature regarding that action. At one point, when one governor went out and the next one was elected, they asked for everybody to do a letter of resignation at the beginning, and I didn't do one because I was in the middle of my term, and the deputy commissioner said, "Oh, where's your letter of resignation?" I said, "Well, I'm not going to do one because it's a fixed term." But I explained that and then sent them a copy of the statute, and then that was not a problem. And the only other independence piece was actually when we got this order to cut our budget by a certain amount, and I had spent a lot of time figuring out how we were going to do it without it negatively impacted the lawyers' salaries because they had to take 2 weeks of leave without pay. But it didn't impact. I was committed to not impacting the people we represented, and And then the governor's office got into a little kerfuffle with the union, I think, where they ordered everybody to pink slip in order to show that I didn't know really what was going on, but we got this order to pink slip a certain number of employees to accomplish this cut. And I had a way to accomplish the cut without pink slipping, and I didn't want to first cause the administrative staff, which made tiny salaries, to be panicky about, how they were going to buy their kids Christmas presents. And I didn't want the clients to be freaking out that their lawyers were being pink slipped. And so I didn't want to do the pink slip. And I actually, Chuck Dunnigan was my husband's law partner and did a lot of labor law. And I went and consulted him and showed him our statute and said, would this be cause to fire me? And he said, I don't think so, because the statute says the public defender makes the determination who to hire to help, something like that. I think the statute's in there, but the public defender may hire other people to do his or her mission. And he said, and if they try to, I'll represent you, and it's for free. And so I didn't pink slip, and it never came to a head, and actually the pink slips nobody actually was fired, I don't think, under those pink slips. It was some kind of something that was a political step that I didn't have anything to do with. But I appreciated our statute, and the fact that our statute provides independence for the public defender, because we're doing unpopular work. I represented Charles Meach, charged with a quadruple homicide of some children, teenagers, and this was my trial judge next to me, and if that's not a popular thing with the public, probably, and the fact that the Department of Law wasn't making decisions about what we were doing, and that we had that independence, and the support of the Department of Administration where we needed a budget increment because how major that case was, a supplemental. I just feel very, very fortunate that each and every commissioner and deputy commissioner I worked with was wonderful to work with, really collaborative, and gave us a lot of support.
Barb, you want to have a reaction to something David talked about that resonates with your experience?
Well, I actually have a similar experience to Senior Justice Fabe, because I think our statute is a great public defender statute. It does try to shield the public defender and its employees from the vagaries of political change and winds of popular trends and unpopular trends. But structurally, there are things that interfere with independence, and the budget is one, because by putting the public defender in the Department of Administration, you have several layers at which different people can cut you. And so we would prepare a budget, submit it to the Department of Administration. Now they're also trying to get their budget passed and the budget of 12 other agencies that are vital to the functioning of Alaska. And depending on who might be in the governor's seat, they might have support, they might not have support. Everybody wants to be a team player, and so they might not understand if you cut the PD by 3%, it is different than the Department of Transportation. Our statute, and then once the budget goes to the governor, of course, the governor can make changes, but before that, it has to be submitted to the legislature. You have the House who considers your budget, the Senate that considers your budget. So there are many opportunities for your independence to be thwarted for other political concerns that might not have anything to do with you or your agency. I had a similar experience in that I worked for one administration for many years. A new administration was elected, and the governor called for the resignation of some department heads, which seems normal, but then it also reached down to the agency level, and I as well explained that I couldn't submit a letter of resignation because I had a term and I had agreed to serve my term, and I was going to continue to serve my term. I had the sense, although no one really told me, that They were not happy with that, but they agreed with my interpretation of the statute. Then they decided that they wanted to control the hiring of the people for the agency, and I think the statute's very clear about that too, that it is the public defender who decides who to hire, not only attorneys, but investigators, support staff, etc. So I tried to explain that the governor's office or the administration should not be involved in the hiring process. And I was unsuccessful in being persuasive. So I thought about it and I said, okay, I'm a team player. Mr. Governor, I'm going to fill out your forms. Every time I hire somebody, which is frequently because we also have turnover problems, I will submit to you this form that says why I want to hire them, what their background is, what they can do to bring positive effect on the agency, and hopefully you will sign that. But if you don't sign it, and after having a conversation we cannot reach agreement, we're going to have a problem. I thought I was perhaps in a little better position to decide who was qualified to take on the responsibilities of being a public defender than some non-lawyer staff person. At any rate, it came to a head on one hire. I made an offer to, a contingent offer to a new attorney, and the governor's office rejected that and said, you know, we don't like a letter to the editor that this person wrote 3 years ago. And I went to this person and explained the situation and said, I want to take this to court. I think my interpretation of the statute is correct, but, you know, your name's going to be out there, everybody's going to know what's going on, and this person would not let me. She withdrew her name from consideration, and we went on and hired the next qualified candidate. So I found that to be a problem. There wasn't sufficient time for that to raise its head again, so that I didn't have an opportunity to continue to try to figure out how I'm going to make it clear that this isn't a good way to hire quality public defenders. But the statute, you have to be careful. You know, I remember during my early days as a public defender, if a person came into the office and said, the police want me to go down there and talk to them, here's the card of the APD officer who saw me, and what should I do? We used to have the ability to self-appoint. A person could say, well, if I'm going to represent you as an ordinary person is entitled to be represented by private counsel, I'm going to make a quick determination of whether or not you're financially eligible, and then I'm going to give you some legal advice, which is, please don't go down to APD and talk to the people involved. I will call them. I will let them know you are available. They don't need a warrant. They can issue a summons. And after some complaints by law enforcement, and this wasn't just an Anchorage problem, it's a statewide problem, our statute was changed so that we could not be appointed until arraignment, and that the only exceptions to that were if the DA wanted us appointed or the police wanted us appointed, which I think is not adequately representing someone to the same extent as a private attorney could represent someone. So while these might seem like little things, resignations, hiring, they're important. And I do think that it is important to maintain the independence of the agency. And I have one more way I think this is a problem. I'm sorry I'm taking up too much of my time, but during my tenure it was hard to get a seat at the table, okay? The Department of Law would draft legislation either raising a penalty or imposing a stricter punishment, and the only way we would find out about it was once the bill was introduced to the legislature. And then our only ability to get our voice heard about how this might affect the clients and the rest of the state was to come to the legislative hearing and testify. That was a completely ineffective way of trying to deal with legislation. The legislation is made in the drafting stages, and with the support of the administration, we were invited to talk to the Department of Law before they introduced any bills and before they drafted things that we thought might be detrimental to the criminal justice system. They didn't always take our suggestions, but they listened, and it wasn't a surprise to anybody if we had a problem with a particular section of the bill. Another example of not having a seat at the table is the burn grant, which the Department of Justice has this money called a burn grant. When I became the public defender, over the last 4 years, they'd given $10 million to the court system, Department of Law, Corrections, Public Safety, to make changes in the criminal justice system and how it would function. I continually made proposals. I continually went before their committee to make a financial appeal to cope with changes that were being made with the Department of Law, and I was turned down every single time. And the problem was I couldn't get a seat at the table of the committee that made those decisions. That committee that took this $10 million and distributed it out was headed by the Department of Public Safety troopers. The court system participated, Department of Law participated, Corrections participated, and they all were awarded federal grants. I couldn't participate, and I got no grants. So an example of how this is still a problem with independence is Attorney General William Barr came to the state of Alaska and said, I am very disappointed in rural justice. I'm going to give you $10 million to fix that problem. Where's the money going? The money's going to hire more police officers, village police officers, VPSOs, support, staff. It's going to buy new equipment. It's going to give training to law enforcement, and it's going to build more public safety buildings, which is more jails. What is all this going to do? It's going to raise the number of cases that are prosecuted in the rural areas, and that could be completely appropriate. I'm not a fan of crime. I want people in the villages to be safe, but nobody is there to think about how this is going to affect the 1 lawyer, 2 lawyer, 3 lawyer office of public defense in that community. And the grant went from $10 million to now I understand it's $42 million. I'm not involved, but I think that a system like that needs to take into account all the players in the system, including the public defense. Sorry to go on and on.
Quinlan, your turn.
I think just to follow up on something Barb said, having a voice through this process is really key. I mean, having the ability to speak your mind about what the issues are and let everyone in the community and the legislature and everyone know what's happening and what to be aware of in terms of budgeting and legislation is critical, because that's the only way things are going to change. Without the expression of what's going on, without an expression of what's needed, nothing can really change. And, there's independence for issues that seem really, really clear, like what is the attorney going to do on a case, to decisions that aren't entirely clear. And there's just a spectrum of things that are going on that need to be considered. How do you serve those cases? And that's a complicated and subtle question often, is how do you make sure that each and every client gets a lawyer and gets the representation that they're entitled to. And I think it often boils down to the ability to express an opinion about how things are working, how things ought to work, and what may need to change to help that go forward. And it has a profound effect, in the short term and in the long term on individual cases, and obviously that impacts the system as a whole. And if the system itself isn't improving and the agency isn't making strides towards that strength and independence, you're just not going to get the effect that Mr. Carroll talked about, that promise of the Sixth Amendment.
Dana, do you follow up?
I think, in the good old days, when the LEAA grant money was sort of at issue, the administration formed something called the Criminal Justice Working Group, and the Public Defender Agency was a member of that group. Art Snowden came for the court system, but it was Dan Hickey. It was for the head of the criminal division. It was all of the commissioner level people from corrections, from the troopers, and when there was a big issue, and even legislation, we had a chance to talk about it, and we actually made joint presentations to the legislature on the criminal justice system budget, so that there would be an understanding by the legislators of the interlocking nature of those budgets, that if you add a prosecutor, or even if you add a judge, you needed more prosecutors and defenders to serve that courtroom. So I think there have been models where that has happened, and it was productive, and I'm not by any means saying that Dan Hickey and I agreed on every piece of legislation which was introduced, but it was a collaborative process with understanding that the criminal justice system can't work unless it is viewed as a system in terms of adequate funding and support for each component of the system, however separate their mission, however separate their focus. So I think that's perhaps worthy of revisiting.
So David talked at length about the importance of providing competent and effective representation. I think it's implicit in the conversation that that becomes a problem when caseloads are too large to handle ethically and effectively. But maybe we need some definitions. How do you decide when the caseloads are too large to handle ethically? Anyone on the panel have an answer to that? David?
Sure.
The people might be familiar with what's called the NAC standards, the National Advisory Commission standards, that were created in the early 70s. But there is some misunderstanding about those. They say that a lawyer should handle no more than 150 felonies if that's the only type of case he or she handles, or only no more than 400 misdemeanor cases if those are the only types of cases he or she handles. And indeed, the ABA 10 principles in Principle 5, talking about workload, references those standards, but they say that simply that those standards should never be exceeded. But what the standards actually say is that you should develop jurisdiction-specific workload standards. Things like travel. I've done a lot of work in Las Vegas. The jail, the prosecutor's office, the court, and the public defender office is all on the same block. You can do a lot of cases, more so than a lot of other jurisdictions where I've been. I was just in rural parts of Nevada where, from one end, from one courthouse to the other can be a 3 hours drive. The public defender is expected to be at each courthouse every other day. And so the number of cases that person can handle is obviously far fewer than what the NAC standards say. Now, this is when I usually take a defensive position in a room full of public defenders. But I think the actual answer is that the only way to be able to ensure effective workloads is if public defenders start tracking time. I know that's a sensitive subject to you all, that you've been through a recent time study. But unless and until public defenders can track their time and show policymakers what it is you do and what the impact of policy is on your work, you're never going to get ahead. So for instance, across the country, there's a lot to do with police wearing body cams right now and what that means to the work of public defenders. You may have a body cam going as the police drives 45 minutes to the police station or the jail. And as public defenders, you need to sit and watch every single second of that trip to see what's being handled. Or as something else like all the cameras that are out there from other places that you have to review. Well, if the policymakers want to move towards even more police body cams or something like that, you would be able to show exactly what the difference was from before that policy to what it was after on your workload. And it may be that, a standard felony goes from 15 hours to 30 hours worth of public defender work. But then you can go to the policymakers and show them exactly what that is. And so I've been running up this hill for 20 years. But what I've seen with technology is time tracking has become easier and easier for public defenders, and those that are tracking time and tracking it well are the ones that are getting more and more resources for their work. So I put that out there. You can shoot arrows at me later, but that's what I wanted to say.
We are close to out of time, so here's one question I really wanted to get to. I assume we've got a room full of people who generally support the mission of the Public Defender Agency. What can people who are not public defenders do to support the public defenders? Yeah, go ahead, Glenn.
I think this goes back to what I was commenting on earlier. There's this entire public process that goes on, and few people are participating in it and commenting on it, is participate in the process of criminal justice legislation and budgeting hearings, and talk to the legislature and talk to elected officials and talk to people in your community about what's going on and what's needed. There needs to be, in my opinion, more voices on this issue, and that's how change ultimately occurs. And in the time that I worked in Juneau, you could see the impact of even a few voices on a particular issue, spending the time educating themselves and then educating other people on how this impacts our community. A few people have made a big difference on a lot of different issues, and I think that's what we can all do.
I have a really practical suggestion looking around this room. One of the things I was proud of doing at the agency was instituting a training program for public defenders statewide. And I know with resources not being available, we always did it actually by pointing at former public defenders who were having successful trial careers to come in and assist our current public defenders with, anything from how to do a good cross-examination and trial procedure to appellate work. And I would say, I don't know if Sam Sherrill is thinking about training, but if she were to point at you and you're not there anymore, and to kind of come volunteer your time to help train trial attorneys on trial pointers, I think that's something that a lot of people in this room, I'm looking at Colin Middleton, and others, who could really contribute in a very concrete way.
Barb?
I think we have to change the way this country thinks about criminal justice. We have to help people recognize that it's either a three-legged stool or a four-legged table. I've heard both analogies, but that the impact of one part of it not working really hurts everybody. The impact of needing a delay impacts everybody in the system. And I agree, politics in Alaska, it's a small world, and if you have an opinion, it's good to express that. Now, I don't know how much support you're going to gain if, as a public defender, you call your legislative representative and say, I'm really concerned about the PD budget, but you can certainly educate the people around you, and former public defenders, of which there are many that we've asked to continue to help us, could also participate in educating and calling. And it is true, a few phone calls can make all the difference in the world.
All right. I think that we are precisely out of time, so can we thank the panel for being here?
I didn't get to the